The fluorescent lights of the hospital laundry room hummed their constant mechanical song as Hannah Clarke folded surgical linens with the precision of someone folding a flag at Arlington. Her hands moved in practice sequences, corners aligned, creases sharp enough to cut, stack height exactly 12 inches before rotating to the next pile. 3 years at Cedar Creek Medical in Raleigh, and no one had ever asked why a floor nurse folded linens like a soldier standing inspection. No one had asked about the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she pressed flat against her palm every morning before her shift started. The patch was all she had left. Official records said Captain Hannah Clarke had never existed. The Pentagon's databases had scrubbed her clean. 3 tours in Tikrit were gone. The extraction op that went sideways and became a political liability, erased. Her decoration sealed. Her service record archived into a classification level so high that even asking about it would trigger a federal investigation. So she folded linens in a hospital laundry room in Raleigh, North Carolina, and no one knew they were standing next to a legend. Her left leg bore a slight limp that she'd learned to minimize over the past year, a souvenir from the operation that officially never happened. She'd been told never to surface, never to acknowledge her name outside the walls of cleared buildings, never to contact any member of her team. Disappear, they said. Vanish. Let the world believe Captain Hannah Clarke was dead or had never served at all. The invisibility suit fit her perfectly. She'd been wearing tactical gear and body armor for 18 years. This fluorescent invisibility was just another uniform. She moved through Cedar Creek's corridors like a ghost in faded green scrubs, her competence so quiet that doctors forgot to notice her, nurses stopped including her in break room gossip, and administrators approved her requests without reading them because Hannah Clarke never made problems. Hannah Clarke never made noise. The supply room air was cool, carrying the ghost scent of industrial bleach and starch. She hung her jacket in her locker, the one with her name printed on a label in permanent marker, and checked her phone. No messages. There never were. Her apartment was empty. Her contact list held only the hospital directory. The few Marines from her unit who'd survived the Tikrit operation had been scattered across bases from San Diego to Washington State, and the order was clear: no contact. No reunion. No acknowledgement. They didn't know where she was. She didn't know where they were. That was the point. That was how you disappeared. The shift briefing was at 6:22 a.m. Hannah arrived 14 minutes early, as always, and began her rounds at 7 o'clock sharp on the dot. 3rd floor, East Wing. 12 patients. Most were post-op or recovering from minor procedures. Most didn't notice her. She changed 4 lines with the steady hand of someone who'd inserted central lines in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter while rounds impacted the fuselage. She checked vitals with the precision of someone who understood that pain was data, that a single millimeter of swelling could mean the difference between recovery and catastrophic failure. Her movements were economical, efficient, born from the kind of training that cost the government $300,000 and the military 8 years of her life. Room 307 was where everything started to change, though Hannah didn't know it yet. The man lying in the hospital bed was Marcus Webb, 43 years old, paralyzed from the waist down from an IED strike in Kandahar 4 years ago. His medical chart indicated moderate traumatic brain injury, intermittent memory loss, and a prognosis that had gradually shifted from hopeful to resigned. He stared at the ceiling most mornings, didn't speak much, didn't seem to register much. Hannah approached his bed with the same quiet competence she brought to every patient. She checked his catheter, reviewed his chart, and began adjusting the morning medications into his purport. That's when she saw it. His right forearm bore a tattoo in block letters, thick black ink that had aged well over the years. The letters read Clarke. Her hand stopped moving for exactly 1 breath. 1 measured inhalation. 1 precise exhalation. Her composure didn't crack. Her face didn't change. But her right hand, the one holding the 4-line, steadied into something harder, colder, something that had pulled Marcus Webb across 200 meters of open ground in Tikrit while rounds snapped past her head and his blood soaked her uniform, and the extraction team was 3 minutes out and he was dying. She'd carried him. She'd screamed at him to stay conscious, stay alive, stay with her. And he'd made it. And his unit had tattooed her name on his arm as a memorial, because they all thought she was dead. Because officially, she was. Marcus didn't recognize her. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. His breathing stayed shallow and regular. There was no spark of memory, no moment of recognition, no indication that the name tattooed on his own skin meant anything to him at all. The TBI had taken that. The trauma had stolen it. Whatever synaptic connection had once linked the word Clarke to the woman who dragged him through hell had been severed by the blast that paralyzed him. Hannah completed his morning medications without another pause. She documented his vitals in the chart: BP 118/74, heart rate 68, O2 sat 97%, and moved on to the next patient. But something had shifted. The carefully constructed walls of her invisibility had developed a hairline fracture. She just didn't know how deep it went yet. Dr. Mercer watched from the nurse's station, his eyes tracking Hannah's movements with the kind of focused attention that had nothing to do with patient care. He was a tall man, elegant in the way that old money and Ivy League educations produced elegance, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the kind of smile that made people underestimate his intelligence. He was very intelligent. He was also very corrupt. For the past 2 years, Dr. Mercer had been systematically inflating surgical supply costs through a medical equipment vendor called Asclepius Medical Solutions. The markup was subtle, 5% here, 8% there, nothing that would trigger audit flags. The kickbacks flowed back to him through a shell company registered in Delaware, approximately $40,000 per month, which he deposited in cash through 3 different banks under different account names. It was a beautiful system. It was a flawless system. It was a system that was about to develop its first serious problem, and that problem was named Hannah Clarke. Mercer's office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the parking lot, mahogany desk, original oil painting of a sailing ship from the 19th century. He kept his surgical supply logs on a spreadsheet he'd created himself, one that he alone understood. The numbers were obfuscated through a series of cross-references and accounting procedures that would take an average person weeks to untangle. He'd counted on that. He'd counted on no one at Cedar Creek having the kind of methodical, tactical mind that could see through layers of bureaucratic camouflage. He hadn't counted on a former Special Forces officer working as a floor nurse in his hospital. He hadn't counted on Hannah Clarke reviewing the supply requisitions and charge notes with eyes trained to identify discrepancies in hostile intelligence reports. Hannah had noticed the first inconsistency on her 3rd week at Cedar Creek Medical. It was minor, a surgical supply order for cardiac catheter kits showing a unit cost of $840 when the standard market rate was $420. She'd noted it in passing, mentioned it to the supply chain coordinator, who shrugged and said that Mercer had negotiated a special contract with Asclepius. The next inconsistency came 3 months later. Then another. And another. By the end of her first year, Hannah had quietly documented 17 separate line items where Cedar Creek was paying double or triple the standard market rate for supplies that were identical to those purchased by Emory Healthcare, Duke Medical, and the VA hospital in Durham. She'd said nothing. She'd done her job. She'd folded her linens and charted her medications and pressed her unit patch against her palm in the pre-dawn darkness of the locker room. But she'd been trained to notice patterns. She'd been trained to identify threats. And the pattern in Mercer's supply chain was the mathematical equivalent of an enemy movement that didn't add up. Dr. Mercer stood at his office window, watching Hannah move through the hallway below, her movements economical and precise. She'd been at Cedar Creek for exactly 1,095 days. He'd hired her because her references were impeccable and her background check had come back clean, no red flags, no complications, nothing that would have signaled the truth. She was quiet. She was efficient. She was the kind of person who faded into the background. Except he'd noticed something in the past 3 weeks. Her charting had become more detailed. Her documentation of supply usage had become more precise. She was cross-referencing charge codes with actual inventory numbers. She was asking the supply chain coordinator about contract terms. She was asking questions that someone who didn't know any better wouldn't think to ask. And Mercer, who prided himself on his ability to read people, understood that Hannah Clarke was the kind of threat that didn't announce itself. She was the kind of threat that quietly assembled evidence while everyone else was thinking about their own problems. He pulled up his spreadsheet and reviewed the numbers one more time. Everything balanced. Everything was perfect. And yet, as he watched Hannah disappear around the corner near the elevators, her faded green scrub somehow managing to look military in a way he couldn't quite articulate, a single thought occurred to him with the precision of a scalpel slicing through skin: that woman is going to cost me millions. And that was when the real nightmare began. At 2:02 p.m. on a Tuesday, Dr. Mercer entered Marcus Webb's room without knocking, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that made every nurse on the floor instinctively straighten. Hannah was there, adjusting Marcus's left shoulder with the precision of someone who understood that pressure sores didn't care about hospital protocols, they cared about time and attention. Marcus's wife sat by the window. Their daughter, maybe 16, scrolled through her phone without looking up. "Nurse Clarke." Mercer's voice carried the weight of an announcement. "Perhaps you'd care to explain why you've logged 14 unauthorized overtime hours this month." Hannah straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her scrubs. The gesture was controlled, deliberate, the kind of movement that came from years of doing things right while the world watched for mistakes. "Mr. Webb requires repositioning every 2 hours to prevent tissue breakdown." "The protocol." "The protocol," Mercer cut in, his smile thin as a scalpel, "is that you follow my orders. Not indulge your inappropriate emotional attachments to patients. This is a hospital, not a charity for washed-up soldiers playing nurse." The room contracted. Marcus's daughter's head snapped up from her phone. His wife's hand froze on the armrest. Hannah took one measured breath, the kind of breath that came from having breathed through worse, and met Mercer's gaze without flinching. A single tear escaped down her cheek, but her voice stayed flat, controlled, the voice of someone who had already calculated every consequence and decided it didn't matter. "Some people are worth the extra time, doctor." She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact. Mercer's jaw tightened. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even tears that would require him to call HR. Instead, he'd gotten dignity. It infuriated him in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. He turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the same aggressive rhythm they'd arrived with. Through the window of Marcus's room, Hannah watched him disappear around the corner, already pulling his phone from his pocket. The next morning, the break room filled with the usual sounds of a Wednesday shift change, the hiss of the coffee machine, the mechanical beep of the microwave, the soft scrape of chairs. Hannah entered with her lunch in a paper bag, exactly as she had every day for 3 years. She opened the refrigerator, placed her sandwich on the middle shelf beside a yogurt she wouldn't eat, and turned toward the center table where she always Saturday. The room went dead silent. Linda, who'd worked adjacent to Hannah on the orthopedic unit for 2 years, gathered her tray. Joyce, who'd shared stories about her daughter's soccer games during lunch breaks, suddenly stood and moved to the far corner. Ramon, who'd joked with Hannah about the impossible shift schedule just yesterday, turned his back and walked to another table without a word. Within 30 seconds, a bubble of isolation had formed around Hannah like a quarantine field. 20 pairs of eyes found sudden interest in napkins, sandwich crusts, the sudden fascination of their phones. Hannah sat down, opened her sandwich, took a bite with mechanical precision, each movement controlled, deliberate. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from having been trained to hold a tactical position while insurgents fired from 3 directions and medical supplies ran short. This was nothing. This was a break room full of civilians who'd been told she was dangerous. This was manageable. She ate in silence for 14 minutes, counting them by the movement of the second hand on the wall clock. Then she stood, disposed of her wrapper, rinsed her container, and left. As she passed the table where Joyce and Linda had repositioned themselves, neither of them looked up. The fluorescent lights hummed their flat, mechanical song. Behind her, she heard whispers start up again, the sound of coordinated social ostracism, practiced and efficient. By Friday, the write-up appeared on the unit bulletin board beside the shift schedule and the infection control memo. Official letterhead. Dr. Mercer's signature. The language was precise, clinical. Employee Hannah Clarke has demonstrated insubordination and failure to follow chain of command through unauthorized overtime hours and misuse of hospital resources. Further disciplinary action is pending review. 18 words that didn't mention a single thing about a man with her name tattooed on his arm. 18 words that didn't mention the fact that she'd stayed late because his respiratory function had changed in ways the overnight nurse might not catch. 18 words that were pure strategy, pure chess, pure institutional power masquerading as protocol. Every nurse who walked past the board slowed down. Read it. Looked away quickly. Hannah removed the write-up at 6:43 a.m., when the hallway was empty except for a custodian pushing a cart 2 floors above. She held it carefully, unfolded it once, and studied Mercer's signature, the confident slant of a man who'd never worried about consequences because consequences were something that happened to other people. Then she folded it in half, placed it in her locker beside her jacket, and pressed it against the faded green unit patch sewn into the lining. The patch was from the 75th Ranger Regiment, Bravo Company, circa 2009. It had survived 3 tours and everything that came after. It had survived the extraction from Tikrit that officially never happened, the records that were scrubbed, the decorations that were sealed. It had survived becoming Hannah Clarke, RN, at Cedar Creek Medical in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she folded surgical linens and stayed late with paralyzed patients and kept her hand steady while the world tested her composure. The patch would survive this too. But that wasn't the worst part. In the supply room that afternoon, Hannah cross-referenced the surgical inventory logs against the procedure database, the work of 30 minutes revealing patterns that had probably been invisible to anyone not trained in military logistics, in tracking resources, in understanding when the numbers didn't add up, in knowing the precise mathematical shape of theft. There were phantom surgeries. Operations billed to insurance companies that had never occurred, charges for equipment that had never arrived on the unit. Invoices from Apex Medical Solutions, a company she'd never heard of, for $47,000 in orthopedic hardware. Date-stamped, officially logged, utterly fictitious. She photographed each page with her personal phone, the camera flash silent and clinical. Numbers climbing. 34,000. 47,000. 89,000. The total was accumulating like a body count, each surgery a ghost, each invoice a message that the chief of surgery at Cedar Creek Medical had figured out how to turn the hospital's own system into an ATM. She was photographing the 89th phantom procedure when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She pocketed the phone, closed the ledger, and was pulling a box of gloves from the shelf when Dr. Mercer rounded the corner. He slowed, his eyes moving from her face to the closed ledger to the shelf she'd been accessing. For 2 seconds, neither of them moved. Then Mercer smiled, the smile of a man who'd just realized his problem wasn't going away on its own. Overtime again, Nurse Clarke. Just restocking. Her voice was steady. Quiet. The voice of someone who'd already made their decision. He stepped closer, and she caught the smell of his cologne, something expensive and sharp, the scent of a man who believed he could buy his way out of anything. You know, I've been thinking about your assignment. The night shift is clearly not working out for you. New schedule is effective immediately. You'll be on the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. rotation. Monday through Friday. No overtime authorizations. She understood immediately. Isolation. Separation from the evening nurses who actually talked to her. Placement on the day shift where she could be watched, where her movements could be tracked, where he could manufacture incidents with a witness. She understood that Mercer was moving to stage for not just social attacks anymore, but strategic institutional moves, the kind that used official channels and policy language. Understood, Doctor. Good. And one more thing. He moved past her toward the supply cabinet. I've requested that your access to the scheduling and email systems be downgraded. You won't need them for patient care. Just follow the posted assignments on the board. She watched him pull a box of sterile gloves from the exact shelf she'd been accessing and understood that he knew she'd been looking at the logistics. That her careful documentation had triggered something in him, the recognition that this was no longer a personnel issue but a containment problem. He was moving like a professional now, moving like someone who had leverage and knew how to use it, and she felt something like respect for his competence even as she understood he was trying to erase her. That evening, Hannah printed the photographs of the phantom surgeries at the public library on Capitol Boulevard using a computer under a false name and an email account she'd created the night before. She mailed the copies to herself, a letter addressed to Hannah Clarke, General Delivery, Raleigh Post Office, dated that day, because she'd learned in Tikrit that intelligence had a habit of vanishing when institutions decided you were a threat. The envelope arrived 3 days later. She held it in her hands for 14 minutes before placing it in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, 847 Fayetteville Street, rent paid in cash for 6 months. Insurance. Backup. The kind of precaution that came from having been part of an extraction mission that officially never happened. Marcus Webb's condition had begun to decline. Small changes. Respiratory function dropping incrementally. His wife had mentioned that Dr. Mercer recommended transfer to a long-term care facility, somewhere quieter, less intensive, better for his long-term recovery. Somewhere that would free up the ICU bed for more profitable cases. Hannah noted every change in his condition with obsessive precision, each measurement a small rebellion, each chart entry a refusal to let him disappear into the system. She had 1 week left before everything changed. She didn't know it yet, but the phone was already ringing in a Pentagon office 200 miles away. Friday night at 9:17 p.m., the scanner crackled 3 times in rapid succession. Multi-vehicle collision on I-40 eastbound, mile marker 287. 6 patients en route. Trauma alert, all available personnel report to emergency department. Hannah was restocking Bay 3 when the announcement came, her hands moving with mechanical precision through the motion she'd performed 10,000 times, gauze, saline, suction catheters arranged in order of urgency. She didn't stop moving. She didn't pause. But her breathing changed. Something in her chest recognized the code before her conscious mind caught up. Organized chaos. That's what her old CO had called it back in Tikrit, when the sandstorm rolled in and the radios went hot. The difference between controlled response and panic was 3 seconds of breath control. The ambulance bay doors burst open like artillery fire. 2 paramedics wheeling the first stretcher, the patient's abdomen distended and rigid, liver laceration from the steering wheel impact, internal bleeding catastrophic. The second ambulance pulled up before the first patient even reached the trauma suite. Then the third. The ER transformed into something that looked like organized warfare, monitors shrieking, residents shouting cross-check confirmations, blood on the floor slick as oil under fluorescent light. Hannah moved between bays with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this under conditions far worse than a Friday night collision. Intubation tube. Rapid infuser set to wide open. O2 climbing from 68%. Code blue in Bay 2. Someone yelled for typo negative. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady as a metronome, carrying a rhythm that meant the difference between a name on a chart and a name on a headstone. At 9:34 p.m., the overhead intercom crackled with Dr. Mercer's voice. All available ICU nursing staff report to emergency department immediately. Code surge protocol in effect. Not a request. An order. The kind that could lock a career. Hannah was in the ICU hallway, headed toward the supply closet for additional blood products, when the second code blue alarm screamed from room 412. Marcus Webb's room. Her feet stopped. Her hands didn't. They were already moving toward the door before her brain caught up with what her body already knew. Marcus lay on the bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps. Tracheal deviation. The left side of his face was swollen, his lips taking on the grey-blue pallor of oxygen starvation. The ICU resident, a third-year named Kowalski who couldn't have been more than 26, stood frozen at the foot of the bed, staring at the monitor as though the numbers would rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. Systolic 72. O2 saturation 58% and falling. Respiratory rate 28. The vital signs of a man drowning in air. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in his chest cavity, compressing his lung, pushing his heart sideways, killing him by increments. Where's Hendricks? Hannah's voice cut through the alarm like a surgical blade. Or two. Ruptured spleen. Maybe 90 minutes before his free. Kowalski's voice wavered on the last word. 90 minutes was not available. 90 minutes was the distance between stabilization and death. Hannah moved to the crash cart without hesitation. Not fast. Not panicked. Moving the way she'd moved when the convoy got ambushed outside Fallujah, when thinking faster than the explosion required was the only thing that kept people alive. She opened the scalpel kit with the efficiency of someone who'd done this procedure before, though not in a hospital. The surgical field was the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. That was where the air pocket was accumulating, pressing against his lung like a fist, and the only way to relieve that pressure was to let it out. Dr. Mercer is pulling all ICU staff downstairs, Kowalski stammered. We need to wait for physician orders. We can't just, there are protocols about nurses performing invasive. The patient is hypoxic. Hannah's hands were already prepping the site with antiseptic. For dots marking the intercostal space. For landmarks. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of muscle memory forged in places where protocols meant bleeding out in the dirt. His O2 is 58. His trachea is deviated. He'll arrest in minutes. But liability and regulatory requirements and... The intercom crackled again. Dr. Mercer's voice, this time direct and cutting. Whoever is refusing to report to the emergency department, you are not following chain of command. Report immediately or expect disciplinary action up to and including termination. The message was clear. Leave Marcus. Go downstairs. Let the system work. Let the system kill him while they waited for someone who was otherwise occupied. Hannah picked up the scalpel. The blade was 14 gauge, surgical grade, sharp enough to separate tissue without trauma. Log my refusal of the order, she said quietly to Kowalski, whose face had gone the color of old bone. Vital sign deterioration requiring immediate intervention. Patient would not survive 90-minute delay. Document that you witnessed the refusal and the clinical reasoning. Kowalski's hand shook as he reached for the charting computer. Hannah made the incision. The cut was clean, precise, surgical. Not the desperate field slash she'd made in Tikrit when there was nothing but a combat knife and a Marine bleeding out from shrapnel to the chest. This was sterile. Controlled. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. The blade separated skin and muscle until she reached the pleural space, and then came the sound, the hiss of air escaping, months of pressure releasing in a single exhalation, the sound of a man's lungs inflating again, the sound of survival crystallizing in a single moment. She placed the chest tube with a 36 French trocar in one fluid motion. Connected it to the drainage system. The water in the collection chamber began to bubble, air evacuating, the pressure against Marcus's heart releasing with every breath he took. The monitor beeped once. Twice. The rhythm settled. O2 climbing. 62, 71. 84, respiratory rate normalizing. Systolic pressure climbing back toward something that sustained life instead of circling it. All of it took for minutes. 3 ICU residents stood in the doorway, their eyes locked on the procedure, on the hands moving through steps they'd studied in textbooks but never seen performed with this kind of certainty. The kind of certainty that belonged to someone who'd done this before when textbooks weren't available and the only reference was keeping a person alive. Hannah secured the tube with sutures and tape, her movements economical and sure, and when she looked up, she found Kowalski staring at her the way people stare at things they don't have vocabulary for. The intercom crackled 3 times. 3 separate overhead calls to report to the emergency department immediately. 3 direct orders from a chief of surgery who had no idea what he'd just interrupted, who'd made a calculation about resource allocation and come up empty because he didn't know what he was calculating toward. Hannah finished the last suture. Marcus's vitals were stable. His chest was rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a breathing human. She removed her gloves and looked at the resident. "Page Dr. Hendricks when he comes out of surgery. Tell him the patient is stable, tube in place, drainage system running. Tell him I'll provide my written report." She didn't mention that she'd made incisions without orders. She didn't mention that she performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight. She didn't mention that there were probably 24 regulations stacked against what she'd just done, waiting for Dr. Mercer to find them and wield them like a weapon. She mentioned only the clinical facts. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed which direction the night was moving. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was walking down to the emergency department because an order was an order, even when you were wearing the uniform of someone who'd spent 3 years learning which orders killed people and which ones saved them, and watching Dr. Mercer's face when he realized she'd disobeyed him in a way that made his authority look small by comparison. Within 40 minutes of Marcus stabilizing, the intercom crackled overhead with Hannah's name, and she knew before she moved what was waiting. The summons didn't come as a page to the break room. It came as an escort, a young administrative aide standing beside her surgical cart with a clipboard and an expression that said this conversation required witnesses. Hannah set down her instrument tray, dried her hands on a towel that smelled like industrial bleach and something underneath it, something chemical that burned the back of her throat. She followed the aide down the corridor, her rubber-soled shoe silent against the linoleum while the aide's leather ones announced every step like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Dr. Mercer's office occupied the corner of the administrative wing, windows overlooking the parking lot where rain was beginning to fall in sheets that hammered against the glass like Morse code. 2 HR representatives already occupied the leather chairs facing his desk. Their laptops sat open. Forms were printed in neat stacks. One of the representatives, a woman with gray-streaked hair and the exhausted expression of someone who'd conducted too many of these interviews, didn't look up. The other, a man whose suit probably cost more than Hannah made in 2 months, arranged his pen parallel to his notepad with the precision of someone who documented everything. Mercer didn't stand when she entered. He remained behind his desk, mahogany and expensive, with a leather chair that probably cost $4,000. His voice, when he spoke, carried the clinical precision of a surgeon discussing a failed tissue sample. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight. Direct violation of your scope of practice and hospital policy." His hands were folded in front of him, surgeon's hands, unmarked and soft. The security footage documents the entire sequence. You accessed the thoracostomy kit. You performed needle decompression. You stabilized the patient without authorization or physician supervision. Hannah stood between the 2 chairs. She wasn't offered one. The male HR representative's fingers moved across his laptop keyboard, pulling up video. There she was, 45 minutes earlier, hands moving with the kind of certainty that only came from having done something 1,000 times before. The footage was silent, but Hannah could hear it perfectly in her head, the hiss of air escaping from Marcus's chest cavity, the monitor's rapid chirp, the sound of her own breathing steady as a metronome while his oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 71 to 82 to 94. "I need to explain the training Hannah began. Mercer raised one hand. Just one. A gesture like a brake pedal pressed down. "I've reviewed your personnel file. Your credentials list nursing school, completion of a 2-year RN program, and standard hospital orientation. Nothing in that file authorizes emergency thoracotomy." His smile appeared then, and it was the smile of someone who'd already won. "I've documented the unauthorized intervention. I've reviewed 3 years of your charting for similar incidents. I've contacted board members who supervise medical credentialing standards. Every single one agrees this represents catastrophic liability." The woman with gray-streaked hair finally looked up. "We're prepared to discuss severance, assuming cooperation with the investigation." How much of the procedure can you justify under nursing scope? Hannah's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Enough that if you were looking for it, you'd see it. But she'd learned long ago how to make visible responses look like invisible thoughts. The patient was coding. The on-call surgeon was in another surgery with. I don't care if the on-call surgeon was on his honeymoon, Mercer cut in. His voice dropped an octave, became something harder. You don't get to decide what's your job. That's not how hospitals work. That's not how authority works. She could have told him then. She could have told them about the extraction from Tikrit that went sideways, the way a simple in and out became a 3-day firefight because the intelligence was bad. About performing field medicine on soldiers who were bleeding out faster than she could stop it, about learning to do things with trauma shears and whatever was available because waiting for a chain of command meant watching people die. About how you learned to trust your hands because your hands were all you had and the training went deeper than any credential ever could. She could have told them that Captain Hannah Clarke had spent 3 years learning emergency medicine from the kind of instructors whose classroom was an active combat zone and whose final exam was whether your team came home or didn't. But Captain Hannah Clarke didn't exist. Officially. The Pentagon had made certain of that. Suspension, effective immediately, Mercer continued, sliding a form across his desk. Pending termination. You'll surrender your badge, your access card, and submit to a full credentialing investigation. He picked up a pen, began writing something on another form without looking at her. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You have 30 minutes. Hannah reached forward and placed her badge on his desk. The plastic caught the light as it slid across the mahogany, her picture staring up at him with a face that looked tired but unremarkable. Just another nurse. Just another person who'd learned long ago that the quietest people in the room often learned not because of what they wanted to know, but because survival demanded it. She removed her access card from her pocket and set it down beside the badge. 2 pieces of plastic. 2 years of careful work. 2 years of being invisible while she watched Dr. Mercer funnel money through phantom procedures and fake supply orders, while she documented everything with the same precision she'd once used to fill out casualty reports. The room was silent except for the sound of rain accelerating against the windows. The male HR representative's fingers still hovered over his keyboard, ready to take notes. The gray-haired woman watched Hannah with something that might have been sympathy or might have been professional neutrality. Mercer had already returned to his paperwork, his signature appearing on 3 more documents, each one another nail in a coffin that contained things he didn't understand. Hannah turned and walked out. Her shoes were silent against the corridor tiles. The administrative aide was waiting to escort her. That was protocol, apparently, making sure fired employees didn't make a scene. Hannah made no scene. She collected her jacket from her locker, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. 74th Ranger Regiment. The only proof she'd ever worn it, the only evidence that some version of Captain Hannah Clarke had once served something larger than herself. The patch was worn almost smooth, cotton threads visible where the synthetic had frayed from 3 years of being pressed against her body, against the vest that used to carry body armor plates, against the harness that held ammunition magazines she'd learned to count by touch. 2 days later, before dawn had properly broken, Hannah received a call on her personal phone. She was to return her scrubs. Hospital property. The laundry room at Cedar Creek would be empty at 5:48 a.m. She should bring everything, keep everything organized, no need for anyone to wait while she folded. The fluorescent lights in the laundry room hummed their relentless mechanical song when she arrived, casting everything in the color of underwater rooms. She had 3 weeks' worth of scrubs, all pressed and folded in her locker, and she removed them 1 set at a time. Navy blue. Comfortable. Worn soft from washing. She laid them out on the counter and began folding each one with the same creased precision she'd once used packing field gear for deployment. Crease. Fold. Crease. Fold. Each movement economical, military. The jacket she'd worn was the last thing in her locker. She lifted it, and the unit patch pressed against her palm as she held it close. Faded. Worn. the thread count barely visible anymore where the embroidered insignia had started to separate from the cloth. This was all that remained. Not a certificate, not a discharge, not official documentation that Captain Hannah Clarke had ever existed. Just cotton fabric with a regiment's name embroidered on it, tucked inside a civilian jacket that was meant to be worn casually, privately, where no one would ever know what it meant. Where no one would ever understand that this small piece of thread was the difference between being someone and being no one. Between having a name and having a clearance level that didn't officially exist. The laundry supervisor, a woman in her 60s with red-lined eyes and the kind of hands that had been scrubbing hospital linens for 40 years, appeared in the doorway at 5:52 a.m. She watched Hannah fold the last scrubs and place them in a neat stack. The supervisor's own hands were trembling. Not with age. With anger. "Shame what they did to you," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly. Everyone knows he was cheating that system. Everyone knew something was wrong, but you were the one they fired. Hannah met her eyes for exactly 1 second. Acknowledging her. Thanking her without speaking. Then Hannah nodded once, removed her jacket from the counter where she'd set it, and turned toward the door. She didn't close her locker. There was nothing left to close it on. She simply walked down the corridor at 6:03 a.m., her footsteps the only sound in the hospital's quiet morning, the jacket heavy across her arms, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried. Because of what it proved. Because of what it could never officially prove, which was exactly why it mattered most. In his office, Dr. Mercer was already at his desk. He'd arrived early. There was always work to do when you needed to erase something. The security footage of Hannah's procedure sat open on his monitor. His cursor hovered over it. One click and it would transfer to the deletion folder. One more click and it would be gone. He'd done this before, adjusted records, removed documentation, made inconvenient footage disappear. The board members would back him. They always did. They needed someone willing to make these decisions, someone with the composure to understand that liability was just another supply cost, just another line item to manage. His finger moved toward the delete button and stopped. Because that was when the intercom crackled. Because that was when everything was about to change in ways he couldn't have predicted. Because the universe was about to deliver a lesson in the precise measure of his miscalculation, and it was arriving not on his schedule, but on time that belonged to someone else entirely. A new ICU patient arrived at Cedar Creek Medical on a Tuesday morning during Hannah's formal appeal hearing, and the universe's timing revealed itself to be infinitely more precise than any administrator's calendar. The patient was paralyzed, another one, but this one different. His name was Khalid Rashid, and he'd been a former Iraqi insurgent turned U.S. intelligence asset until someone decided his continued existence had become inconvenient. An assassination attempt in Istanbul had left him unable to move anything below the neck, his dark eyes tracking movement across the ceiling with the careful awareness of a man who'd spent 3 decades learning how to survive in rooms where mercy was a luxury nobody could afford. Hannah was in the hospital's legal conference room, sitting across from 2 board members and a labor attorney, when the page came through: new admission, ICU bed 3, paralyzed male, requires full neuroassessment. She didn't react. Her hands remained folded on the table. Her voice, when she spoke, stayed measured. "I'd like to return to my unit," she said quietly. The board members exchanged glances, the kind that meant they were uncomfortable but bound by procedure. One of them, a woman named Patricia with a sympathetic face, nodded. Hannah stood and walked out, her scrubs crisp, her badge reflecting the fluorescent ceiling lights like a mirror catching a signal. She descended the back stairwell instead of using the main elevators. Less chance of encountering Mercer, though by now he was confined to administrative corridors anyway, his access to patient care revoked, his future balanced on the knife edge between settlement and criminal charges. The ICU smelled the same as it always did, antiseptic overlaid with something underneath, human fear, the particular metallic tang of someone who'd survived more than they were supposed to. Hannah approached bed 3 without hurrying, her chart already in hand, her eyes already moving through the assessment protocol. The patient's head turned toward her slowly, the only movement available to him. His eyes widened. Not recognition exactly, recognition would have implied memory, but something deeper. Something that existed below consciousness, in the same region where trauma lives like an animal in a cave, ancient and alert. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, Haboob. The word, that call sign, that sandstorm name, the one only her enemies had ever spoken, stopped Hannah's hand mid-motion. The blood pressure cuff she'd been about to attach fell to her side. The room went absolutely still. No monitor noise seemed to penetrate the sudden density of the air. Her eyes met his, and in that single moment, the 3 years of careful invisibility began to fracture. Khalid Rashid had seen her move through Tikrit's dust storms like something that didn't belong to the physics of that place. He'd ordered 40 fighters to kill her. She'd killed 38 of them instead, then carried him, an insurgent, an enemy, across 200 meters of open ground because he'd whispered information that saved civilian lives. He'd watched her disappear into a Black Hawk that shouldn't have been there, into a war that officially never happened, into a fog so thick that even his fevered memory couldn't hold her face clearly. But he would have recognized that precision in her hands anywhere, in any decade, in any life. A visiting Marine colonel entered the ICU exactly 47 minutes later for a routine family briefing with another patient, and he heard the word Haboob pass between Hannah and an ICU nurse asking for clarification on the patient's history. The colonel's jaw tightened. He was wearing a dress blue uniform, the kind that meant he'd come from an official capacity, probably congressional liaison work, probably exactly the kind of position people held when they knew classified things nobody was supposed to mention. He stepped into bed 3's room and looked at the paralyzed man, then at Hannah, then back again. That call sign, the colonel said quietly. It wasn't a question. Within the hour, the colonel was reading aloud from a document, not a copy, an actual classified citation with multiple security markings still visible, describing Captain Hannah Clarke's actions under fire in Tikrit's Jolan district on March 15, 2011, during a mission the Department of Defense would never officially acknowledge. Precision under pressure. 38 confirmed eliminations. 0 friendly casualties. Extraction of a high-value intelligence asset under conditions that violated every standard operating procedure and somehow became the textbook definition of success anyway. The colonel's voice didn't waver as he read it, but his eyes never left Hannah's face, watching for the moment when she would finally stop pretending to be someone smaller. A 2-star general arrived by helicopter at 1,400 hours. Not through the front entrance. Not through any normal channel. He landed on the roof access and descended through the stairwell like something from a different era entirely, wearing dress greens that had been modified for active duty, moving with the specific kind of efficiency that belongs to people who've made decisions that cost lives. He walked directly to bed 3, directly to Hannah, and rendered a salute so sharp it could have cut glass, not the casual hand-to-forehead kind, but the full formal military salute, his arm precise as a compass needle. "Captain Clarke," he said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a distant garage. "Welcome back to the recorded world." That was when Dr. Mercer, standing in the ICU hallway with a chart in his hands, stopped moving entirely. His face drained of color the way fabric loses dye in water, gradually, completely, irreversibly. He'd spent 3 years watching this woman's methodical documentation of his fraud scheme. He'd spent 2 weeks destroying her reputation through orchestrated humiliation and strategic isolation. He'd spent days crafting a suspension pending termination that he believed would remove her from his institution forever. And now a 2-star general was standing in his hospital, in full dress uniform, rendering a salute to a nurse. A Pentagon liaison emerged from the stairwell behind the general, carrying a tablet computer and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been making classified calls at 3:11 a.m. She approached Mercer directly, stepping between him and the ICU room with the precise movement of a woman positioning herself as a barrier. Captain Clarke's code name was Sanctuary, the liaison said quietly. She saved more lives in circumstances you cannot imagine than this hospital sees in a year. Her deployment record is sealed above your security clearance. Her decorations belong to operations that don't exist in any database you can access. And you attempted to terminate her employment based on a life-saving procedure that any field surgeon would recognize as textbook triage under impossible conditions. Do you understand what you've done? Mercer tried to speak. Nothing came out. His mouth moved like a fish pulled onto dry ground, reflexive and helpless. Tom Chen, the hospital's IT director, a Navy veteran with 2 tours in the Pacific and the kind of instinct that recognizes classified weight when he sees it moving through hallways, had already done what Navy personnel do in situations like this. He'd prepared. When Mercer attempted to delete the security footage showing Hannah's emergency thoracostomy, Chen had been watching. Every keystroke logged. Every deleted file backed up to an external server hidden in a hospital closet that was technically his jurisdiction. Chen walked into the State Medical Board's offices with a flash drive containing not just the footage of Hannah saving Marcus Webb's life, but 14 months of Mercer's financial transactions with Apex Medical Solutions. Inflated invoices. Phantom procedures. Split payments moving through accounts designed specifically for plausible deniability. The State Medical Board's investigator watched the footage twice. On the second viewing, her pen didn't move. When she looked up at Chen, her expression was the kind reserved for situations where everything suddenly becomes very simple. By Thursday of that week, Dr. Mercer's hospital access was revoked pending investigation. His office was sealed. The board members who owed him favors suddenly couldn't return his calls. Apex Medical Solutions owner, understanding which way the wind was blowing, negotiated with prosecutors and provided emails detailing the entire scheme. Mercer's attorney advised him to disappear from Cedar Creek Medical's property and prepare for grand jury proceedings. On Friday afternoon, Mercer sat in his car in the parking lot and watched through the windshield as Hannah, fully reinstated, back pay approved, formal apology issued in writing by the hospital's board, walked into Cedar Creek Medical in fresh scrubs. The nurses who'd exiled her were now bringing her coffee. Marcus Webb's wife had delivered flowers and a handwritten note. The general citation was being framed for the hospital's Veteran Services hallway. Mercer started his engine and drove away, his surgical career ending not with confrontation but with the quiet sound of his car door closing, the sound of his future becoming a prison term measured in months and years he couldn't have calculated. 6 months later, Hannah stood beside Marcus Webb's bed during evening rounds, and his eyes, clear for the first time since his injury, focused directly on her face. Recognition flickered across his features like a light finding electricity. His finger, moving with newly restored movement, traced the Clarke tattoo on his arm with the slow deliberation of someone reading Braille. His voice, rusty from disuse but growing stronger every day, whispered, "You carried me." Hannah's composure, the armor she'd worn for 3 years of invisibility, finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not from shame, not from humiliation, but from relief so profound it felt like weight leaving her body. 200 meters, she confirmed softly, her hand holding his with the same steadiness it had always possessed. "You were never too heavy." Marcus's wife sobbed quietly in the corner, her hand covering her mouth. Outside Cedar Creek Medical's front entrance, a medical supply van sat idling at a traffic light. Dr. Mercer occupied the driver's seat, wearing a company polo shirt with Apex Medical Solutions stitched across the chest. His suspension was indefinite. His criminal trial was scheduled for next month. His surgical license was revoked. His house was for sale at a loss. He sat at that red light for exactly 43 seconds, and in that time he didn't look at the hospital building. He didn't even glance toward the entrance where Hannah had entered, invisible again by choice, exactly as strong as she'd always been, exactly as strong as she would always be. Inside, Hannah pinned her badge to her scrubs and walked past the hallway where her write-up had once hung with the deliberate humiliation of public judgment. The write-up was gone now, or expunged, removed, erased in exactly the way her military service had been erased. But unlike her service, this erasure came with vindication. A framed plaque now hung in the same spot, a declassified citation that read, "Captain Clarke's code name was Sanctuary, some heroes save lives in silence." Beneath it, another line, "Cedar Creek Medical, in recognition of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances." The faded unit patch remained sewn inside her jacket lining, still hidden, still the only physical proof of a service that officially never existed. Hannah held it between her fingers one evening as she changed into her street clothes, and the weight of it was exactly what it had always been, proof that she had served, that she had carried wounded men across fire, that she had walked through sandstorms and come out the other side alive. A new nurse asked her one afternoon how she stayed so calm under pressure. How her hands never shook during the most critical procedures. Hannah glanced at the hidden patch in her locker, then back at the nurse. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said simply. She returned to her work, back to the invisible weight of saving lives that nobody would ever officially acknowledge. And that was exactly how she preferred it. If you found yourself in Hannah's position, would you have revealed your past to be vindicated, or held the secret to keep it safe? Subscribe to the Code Whisperers for more stories of hidden strength and quiet heroism, and let us know in the comments which moment changed everything for you.